Art writing needs to change. Have you ever read something about art that sounds like the ecstasy of erasure, or a simulacrum of corporeality, or conviction posturing as teleology, and wondered, hold on, what exactly is this artwork about? These are some extreme examples of the industry standard for writing about art. A lot of artist statements, museum texts, and the like are full of these weird clusters of neologisms, quotes from philosophy, and academic language that takes years of college-level study to truly grasp. But I don't think that that's serving artists, especially as AI is coming for our role in society. I think it's time for our public-facing language to change. I went to art school, I learned this lingo, and I followed the paths laid out for me. Ran a couple of galleries, was an art critic for 7 years, and played all the games. And then I burnt out. Years later, I'm back to making art, and I found that the traditional art world and its institutional expectations weren't serving me and my authentic creative voice. In order to change the systems, we need to first change ourselves. We must start actively calling people in with the language we choose to use, not keeping them out. Unfortunately, most art writing is hard to understand. The pessimist in me says that this is on purpose to gatekeep, but the optimist in me says that artists are curious and smart and they want to take on big ideas. I think most of this writing that I've seen comes from good intentions, but lands flat in connecting with real people. In the last couple of years, I have watched artists I admire build distinct platforms for themselves, sharing authentic stories about their work online. And that refreshing approach is what inspired me to come back to making my own work after quitting. I think before we dive deep, that I need to make sure that I state my critique is coming from a place of love for most contemporary art. Some of it is cringe, some of it is enraging, and some of it is just wealth flaunting. I am not a fan of the concepts of de-skilling, and I do see why some people on the internet are quick to cancel all modern art because of how it's presented, or how some works almost function as rage bait. But all art exists in a larger world, in a larger context. The museum and gallery cannot be the only place we think is valid for art. And language, the language we use to describe our art, is a tool. It can be something that excludes people on purpose or calls them in to the why of why we're making. The way art has been presented to the public up until now is something I really don't agree with. The language I see is often exclusionary and it gatekeeps viewers. Are you in or are you out? I want to see this change before the robots are making all of the art. Okay, so here's my radical idea. We don't actually have to write the way that we were taught to anymore. I tried to make it by following all the rules of the art world, and I fell flat. It made me angry and resentful. As an act of compassion to those who want to make a living from their work and be creative and share their work with the world, even if you don't want to make a living from it, I think we really need to massively shift the way that we present our work to others, to our community, to the world. We need to build a more sustainable way of working and making a living as artists. And trust me, I am coming to you live from the corner of burnout and resentment to bring you this video on the fact that we gotta change, you guys, and we gotta change quick, because AI is here and it is planning to bury us. First of all, my fellow artists and creatives, do we really need to be writing artist statements where we are using language that we know is exclusionary? I mean, I worked in a museum and I know that museum tombstone texts, yes, unfortunately, they are called tombstone texts as if the art is dead. They are written for people who have taken a course in college-level philosophy or art history or both. And that is a smaller fraction of the population than most people consider. Like, on a class-conscious level, are you okay with leaving most people in the working class out of your work? Because I realize that I'm not. And I think that not considering the systems through which you present and share your work is a massive problem. If you find that these systems, be it institutions, small arts organizations, or just the art language rules in general that seep into our work, are not aligning with your values, you don't have to play their game. You actually can opt out and do just fine. This year alone, I have done 5 pop-up markets. I made more from those experiences in a single year than I ever did trying to sell my work in galleries and play the old game. I am now finding new people who want to own my work and hang it in their homes that are from such a wider range of human experience. At these markets, I get to have more informal and informative conversations about each of the pieces that I'm making, and I feel that I'm doing the thing that most artists dream of. I'm making part of my living from selling my work. I got inspired to start doing these markets by attending a huge art event near me called the Kings Mountain Art Fair. There were so many painters with giant booths selling out of prints and originals, with the backdrop of gorgeous second growth redwoods behind them. In this space of both peace and excitement, I felt that I had discovered a new hidden path, an entirely new route available to me that I had never considered before. Mostly because I thought these types of venues, and I was kind of taught that going outside the gallery system would lower my work's provenance, blech, I hate that word, or reputation to be considered more valuable by serious art galleries. But at these markets, I found the freedom to be myself. I met fellow artists, often many of them incredible wise elders, and have realized that there are far better methods for connecting your art to an audience than the grants and gallery circuit of the traditional art world. Plus, there's now social media and the internet, and it's a thing that when I was going to art school was just used for sharing photos of your cats and the food you ate. But people are now able to build communities, and social media and content creation can be a challenge. I'm not gonna lie, it's taken me a month to write this video, but it's the place where we can really differentiate ourselves and show proof of our humanity. We don't need to post 8 times a week or follow the social strategies or make sure that our uploads are all following in this kind of crazy schedule to win at the lottery. I think that we can be slow and be deliberate and find our people still. Through sharing our stories on these platforms, whether the content is short or long, we can emphasize the value of our human-made work. Seeing the rise of artists sharing their processes and practices online, especially here on YouTube, shattered so many of the perceived notions I had about how I should be an artist. I would not be here talking to you on this platform if I did not get inspired by people on here doing this work. Like Chris from Little Tiny Egg, Lee Ellickson, Megan Wang, Tofu Goob, Mew Tripled, and my friend Kelsey Rodriguez. I can't emphasize enough that these people are truly proof that there is another way to be an artist that has nothing to do with the traditional art world. So now, if you're still here, let's talk about the language of the art world and how we could try and change it. So most art writing I've read is hard to understand, on purpose. And once I figured out how to read it, I felt like I had cracked some sort of secret code. But I realized that if I have to crack a secret code, that language is gatekeeping. And gatekeeping is not good, y'all. While the choice to use language that gatekeeps might serve some people in the arts, like the Sotheby's and Christie's and auction houses of the world, I'm not ever gonna be in that space. And it ends up requiring that all artists adhere to these language rules or be left out entirely. I think it's important to also state that I don't want to write off all academic language completely. I think that it has a place and it has a purpose, and a lot of artists find cool ideas in it. It's a perfectly valid and useful research tool. I have been moved to tears by conceptual art, especially the work of people like Felix Gonzalez Torres. I saw his piece in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City with one of the light bulbs burnt out. And I was curious about it. I asked the staff to tell me more. And the staff member told me that they couldn't change the other light bulb until they both burned out. The piece referenced the ongoing grief for the queer community around how many people lost partners to AIDS. And as a person who is both queer and impacted by a disability born from this recent pandemic, this work is worth considering rather than just writing it off. I still sometimes enjoy reading theoretical or academic texts because in them, there can be fun ways to interpret and understand the world. But reading dense theory takes work, and expecting your audience that is supporting your practice to perform that labor in order to understand your art is a truly unfair expectation. It may not seem like we have a choice because art schools and institutions use this highly complex and technical language as an evaluative tool for students. It seems that to be taken seriously as artists, we need to do this too. I want to stress that the problem is not the ideas. The problem is absolutely how we communicate those ideas to people outside of our art world bubble. The true goal of writing is communication. I know that academia used to be a thing for only the ultra-rich, and it seems that it's sort of happening again with the rising price of schools, especially art schools, if you saw my other video on that. But I think that there is still hope out there for people to learn affordably at trade schools, ateliers, community colleges, and state schools. So let's establish the language of academic writing is in fact a holdover from an elite past. There used to be only a rarefied few who would be able to speak and discern the meaning of these texts. So if we know the history and we know the challenges facing our audience, what can we do? Let's consider where else in our culture we are communicating big ideas and academics' discoveries in an informal and approachable way. This is why I love YouTube, and it's why I loved watching the Discovery Channel with my dad as a kid. I have always loved learning about new ideas, and it was rad that my dad and I didn't need a PhD in physics to nerd out about space. Artists need to understand that our writing and our communication needs to be as inclusive as possible, especially if we intend to make a living with our work, or at least connect to our people. In a time where so many of us are afraid of being replaced by AI, the choice to tell a relatable story is essential. The way we communicate about our work to the public needs to shift and needs to adapt to be more inclusive. Because y'all, shit is dire. How are we going to continue to convince people to support real artists if we are gatekeeping ourselves from the general public? There are millions of humans who would probably love our work and our ideas if we would just communicate about them more effectively. Our stories about why we make what we make are huge opportunities where we can make it clear to an audience that our art was created by us humans. This idea is one that has been boiling over in a pot for me for a long time. When I graduated from art school, I was already a little frustrated with the language that was spoken around me. My senior year, our local arts publication closed, and a friend of mine was hosting this really interesting artist lecture series called the Hot Tub Dialogues. It was an art lecture with people in our community in a hot tub. Here are some photos from the event. I deeply wanted to be involved with this, as it seemed like the gallery director, Ayla, had such a way more inclusive and exciting approach to operating in the art world. She was willing to challenge the way things were and invite local artists, curators, and gallery owners to give a talk in a really intimate and vulnerable space. It felt so different than anything I had experienced. So, in order to get credit for helping out with these wild lectures, I created an independent study on art writing. I had to write about them in essays. And in these essays, I absolutely fell in love with the practice of art writing. It felt really like an opportunity to translate these complex ideas and document these rare and weird experiences into something that people could enjoy at any level. And my grandmother was a hobbyist painter. She spent her life dabbling in oils. Here is her work. And to be completely honest, my grandma was my best friend. Every time that I was in my studio listening, I would call her almost every time I was in my studio, listening to old family stories while I was making my work. She loved the essays about the hot tub art lectures, and I got excited that I could help her understand more of what was going on in the contemporary art world. This was exciting. So after graduating, I decided to start an arts publication of my own. I was going to become an art critic for my city and function as a translator. In 2013, I started Informality blog. The goal was to write in a way that was both informal and informative. With the help of a few friends, we built a website and started to review shows in town. We would edit each other's work and continue our goal of creating an arts publication with accessible language. And you're probably wondering, okay, you're a human with a painting degree. What qualified you to do this? Sheer will and spite. I truly hated conforming the way that I did to do well in art school. I knew that there were different ways to talk about art and showcase what was happening as an act of love. It came out of a desire to try and connect local artists to the larger community by using a language that was not that stuffy art lingo. I wanted to help inform people outside of the art world what was happening in the arts around them. Kansas City had a really incredible First Fridays art event, and I always thought that the people who were attending were just passively observing art on a conveyor belt, looking for 5 seconds and walking away, not really trying to understand or engage with it. I actively worked to change that with my team. It felt good to write about people's work and give back to people who inspired me to keep making art. My favorite thing to do for that publication was to do interviews with artists in their studios. It would always strike me the contrast between how artists would talk about their work, inspiration, and influences with me, and how they would write about it. I really wish that they would all just write the way that they spoke. But look, I know why art schools teach artists to write about art like this, to impress the accreditation panels, the academics, the curators, the arts administrators, the art historians, and the other gatekeepers in the art world with the students' knowledge of the larger cultural conversation about art. I've read Foucault and Hegel and Kant and Marx and on and on and on, but I personally still struggle with all of it. I have a disability that makes reading this kind of text excruciatingly difficult. And even with that, I still pushed myself to read, annotate, digest, and even start a PDF club to work with others to study and understand this work. My challenge with this language runs deep. When I was in art school, I could barely make it through my reading assignments. I almost dropped out my sophomore year after having a nervous breakdown in my midterm philosophy exam. I was sitting in a stairwell of our liberal arts building, which was actually a house, trying to explain and defend postmodernist philosophy in a blue book. I just couldn't do it. I often got more out of watching YouTube videos on the topics and thinkers than I did the primary text. This is because of my neurodivergence, which I know now and I didn't then. You combine having a learning disability on top of coming from a working class family and knowing nothing about art history or art theory, and you get people like me, artists who felt so left out in art school. And I know from the comments on my last video that there's many of you out there just like me. There were students around me who grew up going to museums, and students who knew their theory so well and probably had photographic memory that they could quote it and name drop different thinkers and critiques and discussions, and professors loved that behavior and graded students accordingly because of it. I had great admiration for my professors, and I wanted to not only earn their approval, but someday get the opportunity to be considered colleagues. If I wanted to be a fellow academic, I would have to learn the theory and integrate it fully into my creative practice. And I'll admit that once I started to get it, I ended up finding quite a bit of enjoyment in reading these dense texts, because in them, buried in complicated language and kind of wacky French translations, were exciting ideas. My friends and I would geek out in long text messages when the ideas started clicking. These were ideas that I could get behind and see value in, yet I knew, deep down, that basing all of my work on these ideas, or forcing myself to root my work in concepts, felt like grasping. I felt like I was spending more time trying to search for theoretical texts that I could use to defend my creative interests, rather than just pursuing my curiosity and making my work. As artists, if we expect our audience to put in this much effort, we inevitably are going to feel let down. We will continue to perpetuate the myth of the starving artist and give power to institutions and administrators that benefit from systems where only a rarefied few artists make it. Now, looking back, I think my work as a critic with Informality started out with really great intentions, but ultimately didn't quite deliver on its core purpose of being informal and informative. I still felt the need to fit in, the pressure to cover shows by people in my network that I admired or that were offering the publication some sort of help. I wanted this work to be a gift to my community. I wanted the writing to be sincere and authentic. The further I got into the work, the more I realized that the desire to be well-liked was pushing me to conform. We started using art jargon in our reviews. And the more I wanted to be valued as a critic, the more I was putting my priorities on hold to make others happy. In 2020, just before the pandemic, I stepped away from the project due to a few reasons. 1, we were running out of funding. 2, we were experiencing some pretty massive burnout amongst our staff, who were mostly volunteers, and the expectation of volunteerism from the community was getting super egregious. For example, I had someone email me a 40-page essay, that was their artist statement, in exchange for a cheeseburger from Culver's. Not okay. Despite our efforts, our little team did what we could to be inclusive, regularly check ourselves, and share the wealth that we got through grants to pay writers in our community. I made very little during our time in Informality, and most art critics today make almost nothing. Usually payments range between $50 to $200 for an article, and that's why you see publications like Informality and the one that used to be here in the Bay Area, Art Practical, disappear. If artists are relying on art critics or curators to be their translators rather than doing it themselves, they're going to be let down. So, if we are losing art critics, publications are going extinct, and the way we were taught to write as serious artists is actually gatekeeping and limiting us, then what can we do to change our writing? First, I think we must consider our story. Is a particular theory or writer driving your practice? Tell that story that helped you get into it, rather than just quoting the text. Is there a medium that makes you feel giddy every time you smell it? That's how I feel about oil paint. Is the texture of the paper making you excited? That's me with arches. My God, it's so good. The feeling of your brush or pencil against a surface exciting you and making you return to the studio every time? Let's talk about that stuff, y'all. Let's romanticize our art. Let's talk about what makes our work human. I recommend reading the book Storyworthy by Matthew Dix. He's a 56-time winner of the Moth Story Slam, and if you're an avid NPR listener like me, you've probably heard one of his stories. He's got this really great system in the book known as Homework for Life, where you consider the small little stories that happen every day of your life, and you find ways to track them. There are so many big and small things that happen in the lives of artists. These are all things that can, in part, be shared in order to connect with people on a more human level. So, to end this, I thought we could do a little self-roast. If you stuck around this long, thank you. You're the kind of person I hope will consider becoming a subscriber and following along as I attempt to unlearn how I should be as an artist. Maybe join me in doing it yourself, share feedback in the comments, and hang out on my Discord server. There's links down below in the description. I am now going to share a piece of my writing that is embarrassing and deeply within this language game. We are going to read it and edit it together live because I believe roasting myself and owning my past is an essential part of this. So I'm going to go to my website with my little computer here that I have. So I'm looking at my laptop, and so I'm going to my website and I'm going to head over to the last big series of work I was making in the context of the traditional art world, my watercolor paintings of my laptop. So you can see here they are. And yes, these are watercolor paintings. Dude, I know that they are giving illuminated manuscript energy, and I definitely felt like a monk when I was making them. You know, painting text with watercolor is a unique choice. But when I was writing about this work, I was trying so hard to look good for grad schools I was applying to, and I haven't edited this writing yet on my website, and it's lived on for many years because change is hard, you guys. So let's first read through line by line, and then I'm gonna edit this with y'all and talk about what I'm changing. So first, I'm gonna read it. The Command-Shift-3 works are watercolor drawings on paper that reference the keys held to perform a screenshot. Digital spaces often embody a view of our psyche that is raw and unfiltered. The devices we own are a physical representation of our thoughts, actions, and communications. Our work, entertainment, relationships, and experiences occur more often in a simulated sense of space on our phones and computers. These snapshots show an honest, unfiltered viewpoint into our lived experiences. These places we exist in the virtual often reflect our experience of home. We arrange and attempt to create a space that aligns with a desirable version of ourselves. However, the desktop is one of the most clarifying spaces for highlighting the fragmented nature of our inner self. What? Each open application to a different conversation or Google search reflects a different train of thought and ultimately a different part of our identity. There are too many projects, too many side hustles, or layers of meaning we assign to ourselves. All of our open windows showcase opportunities for new understanding of who we are through what we do. We perform self through the flawed organizational methods of workflow, or lack thereof. Playlists, email chains, all of the tabs, late night notifications, and desktop clutter. Command-Shift-3 are safe points in digital memory of particularly affective moments in time. Okay, so there's not really a lot of neologisms here, but I do think that some of the ways I phrase things is a little bit egregious and a little bit art-speaky. So let's go ahead and edit this. All right, so I'm actually gonna just go through and clip this line by line so that way I can arrange each section as I'm rewriting it. Okay, so the Command-Shift-3 works are watercolor drawings on paper that reference the keys held to perform a screenshot. I think the first problem I have with this is that it's not talking about the fact that this is on a Mac, and I think that calling them watercolor drawings was like a weird thing that I was really interested in back in 2018 and 2017 when I was making this work, is trying to like justify that these are drawings and not paintings. They're paintings. They're made with paint. So we're gonna call them paintings. So I am going to instead say, and I'm not gonna say I don't like that I'm talking in third person. That's kind of weird. Okay, Command-Shift-3 is a series of watercolor paintings that reference the keys held on a Mac to take a screenshot. Cool, okay. Digital spaces often embody a view of our psyche. Okay, I don't want to use the word embody. I don't want to talk about views of my psyche. I don't need that stuff. That sounds really pretentious. So I am going to remove that. I'll make that italic. So I'll delete this one. And then I think I'm going to make it a lot simpler. Like the places we live digitally often show a lot about where our head is at on a given day. Yeah, where my head is at, not where my psyche is. I don't want to know about my psyche. You don't want to know about my psyche. Okay, so next up, the devices we own are... Oh, and then the raw and unfiltered bit. So maybe I can add... it can show our too many open tabs, because I always have way too many tabs open, our unending to-do lists, which is why this video took me so long to make, and the long group chat with our closest friends. And the ways we wind down from work, which for me is with games and videos. So what I'm trying to do here is, instead of just saying these like really abstracted versions of the language, I'm being hyper specific, and I'm trying to create a story, create an environment that is going to be tangible and relatable to whoever is looking at the website. They're like, oh yeah, like I relate to, you know, the long group chat or the open tabs or the to-do list, or even just like I wind down with games and videos, which is why you're here on the YouTube. So then next up, the devices we own are a physical representation of our thoughts, actions, and communications. I don't think I need to say they are a physical representation. I think this is another proof of a little bit of that art speak of like making it more complicated than it needs to be when a simpler version would do. So I'm gonna try this. So our relationship with the devices we carry around is both familiar and intimate. Maybe strangely intimate. I like strange. My relationship with my devices is definitely strange. Okay, strangely intimate. We almost always have at least one by our side. So much of our world takes place on our computers. And the desktop shows are open. And the desktop is one of many places we live a large portion of our lives. Okay, that feels a little bit better. All right, so then our work, entertainment, and experiences occur more often in a simulated sense of space on our phones and our computers. I don't know that I need to talk about the fact that the space is simulated. I was like really into, whoa. All right, so I'm gonna remove this section here about how our work often occurs in a simulated sense of space. I was really into these big ideas about how we were living sort of disembodied lives in a simulated sense of space in the digital, but this, I think, is proof that as artists, we can have these big, heady academic ideas or things that we're reading about, but they don't necessarily have to be in the statements that are public facing. So I'm just gonna get rid of that. And then I think I want to tell a little bit more of a story about where my head was at. So these snapshots show an honest and unfiltered viewpoint into our lived experiences. I think I'm making a big generalization talking about our lived experiences when really it needs to be, I used these digital collages and subsequent paintings to tell short stories. Because that's what I was doing about change, growth, adaptation, and hope. Because that's where my head was at. I was like making these and dealing with a lot of grief and loss and change for my art world self. Okay, so we attempt to create a space that aligns with a desirable version of ourselves. I don't think we need that. That's a holdover from when I was making art about The Sims. However, this desktop is one of the most clarifying spaces for highlighting the fragmented nature of our inner self. That's a little too theory. So I'm going to get rid of that. Each open application to a different conversation, Google search, reflects a train of thought. So that I added in about the YouTube videos and ultimately a different part of our identity. There are too many projects, too many side hustles, or layers of meaning we assign to ourselves. I don't hate that. I think that that's probably one of the best parts in it. So I might keep that. I wanted these paintings to make my audience consider what it means to live in a way that is very digital and online. There are too many projects, too many side hustles, or layers of meaning we assign to ourselves. All of our windows showcase an opportunity for understanding. We perform the self, again, art language. We perform the self through flawed organizational methods of workflow, I perform myself through my desktop chaos, or lack thereof, playlists, email chains. I want to just simplify this. I think what I want to do is talk about the way we share ourselves through our devices. Changes depending on the unspoken rules of an app or digital space. I think that makes sense. I'm gonna end it with some hope. I hope that you see bits of yourself and your own digital life in these pieces. Okay, so like super simplified, and I'm going to save this, and now it's permanently like that on the archive. Okay, I think the problem with that piece of writing is that I sounded detached, and telling people about my work was coming from this position of an outsider, and I wasn't being vulnerable. And I think that if we're constantly shying away from vulnerability and authenticity, that is just not what I want to be a part of. So, yeah. Now that I have a better statement for the site, let's get back to those of us making the art. Artists. When we are writing about our work, we do have a choice. If we are writing in a way that is only legible and understandable to a small portion of people, traditionally educated artists and people who took art history or philosophy in college, what we are doing is choosing to disassociate from working class people. If you were paying attention to Uncle Carl, you probably shouldn't alienate the working class, am I right? Accessibility of language is so important. Clarity is important. Getting people on board with what you are doing is important. The starving artist myth exists because we, meaning me too, LOL, have fallen prey to the need to impress the ruling class. The people at the auction houses, the people running and owning museums. There are probably some of you watching this video who really value making sure that your art is rooted in theory, and that's okay. Don't stop loving the things you love just because of a YouTube video. I have made the conscious effort myself, though, to no longer do that because it was making me incredibly unhappy. I am a recovering academic. I am not saying to run away from the theory completely, but instead choose to write in a more conversational tone when you are sharing your work with the world online. If your ideal audience is truly the kind of collector who values obscure and opaque language in your artist statement, that's fine. But there are fewer of those people in the world than the larger scale potential audience who could care about you and your work if you choose to include them. Y'all, if you are posting your work on social media and you want to connect with people, you need to abandon the rules of the art world. Join me in doing so. The moral of this story is that we have a choice as artists and as humans to expect something different. We can start to build a new art world where our creativity isn't buried under these big layers of jargon or overcomplicated language. And instead, we can ground our writing in our actual, real-life, tangible experiences. Artists can make the radical choice to communicate with clarity and authenticity and vulnerability, to include people in and call them in rather than keeping them out. Hopefully, if you found this video helpful and you want to learn more about building an entirely new framework to talk about and write about your art, sign up for my newsletter and maybe help me keep making videos like this by becoming a paid supporter. Until then, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and until next time, stay creative and find your own ways to persistently bloom. See ya! Do not attack the tripod! Whatever, just continue. It's fine.